How are you today? Great. So this is a very special session, as I said you yesterday, because I welcome Dr. Neeta Goyal for this morning session. She represents an organization called TIE, and she is Senior Evaluation Specialist. Now friend, while she carries huge and very rich experience of more than 2 decades in the field of program and policy evaluation, I had just initial chat with her, and the point that I was raising on the first day, that in no research methodology workshop for law, we ever give attention to the possibility of seeing whether the program evaluation or law evaluation is possible. And I think I have circulated one paper to you which talks about law impact assessment. Now, the core question which validates the existence of this particular session is that we have number of laws, but in case of laws we do not have any idea as to whether they are working for the objectives for which they have been created, because we have no mechanism to subject them to any kind of evaluation. Now, how the evaluation of the laws is possible, or how the law impact assessment can be possible, or how a particular program, there are a lot of social security schemes, there are a lot of programs for the weaker sections, for the people below poverty line, for this, that. So government keep coming with so many programs which are implemented at the state level or at the different level. But how those programs can be subject to evaluation, that is something very important, because it follows a certain kind of methodology. So I'm happy that I had started a couple of years ago, and then I was searching somebody, because the methodology for this particular purpose is going to be very, very specific. So I think she will introduce us to this method of evaluating the programs, policy, and she's an expert in this particular field. So she is. I'm thankful that you have agreed to come to us, and I earlier had Francis from the same organization for a different workshop, and I was really impressed with the entire presentation that he made. So I requested him to from somebody from his organization to take part. So I'm happy they have deputed Dr. Neeta, who is an expert in this area. And I'm sure this session is going to be very, very useful, very unique. I am sure you might not have heard any session so far. I can making this exaggeration, but I can safely, because I am aware of the health of legal research in this country, because we are still struggling with the basics in empirical legal research. We have not yet reached to that level which can take us to the evaluation studies, because there is a whole lot of heavy studies is happening in other fields. Management, Niti Aayog is, productivity council, but law is not there. My whole objection is that law deals with policy, law deals with program. Every program like Manrega and all those, they are followed by an act, like environment. So environmental law has a feature of impact evaluation. Land acquisition law has a feature of impact study. Now, how that impact study can be done? That is the core question. And I'm sure we are going to be enlightened by your presence. I leave the floor for you. They are all the teachers and the scholars, mostly majority in the field of law, and they are teaching in different law schools across the country. They are taking a lot of interest in this workshop. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Professor Bajpai, for the invitation to be here. Many, many years ago, when I was in college, one of the career options that I thought about was becoming a lawyer. But I chose not to, because at that point of time, when I was doing some investigating on what it means to be a lawyer, I found that there's a lot of things you need to memorize, like case histories and what was precedent to a case and all of that. Can't say my memory would have worked very well in those circumstances. So I chose not to do law. but I'm delighted and honored to be in a group of, to be among you, and to be able to share some things of what I know, and then also learn from you, because the legal field is not something I know too much about. So I'm hoping we can put my side of the picture and your side of the picture today together, and then see what is the final picture that emerges. I do think during the course of my career, okay, the organization I work on, we focus on impact evaluations, and we focus on mixed methods, which involve both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. But I haven't previously heard of training programs like this, whether it's in law or in some other fields as well. It's very difficult to find a course that actually combines these two, and I see in your agenda that tomorrow you're going to be talking about SPSS and Atlas TI. You're going to be receiving some training on how to use software to do the analysis, data analysis. I think that's incredible, because in today's day and age, it's still really hard to find all of this in one workshop. So hats off to you all for for being visionaries, and for all of you to attend a workshop like this. It is an adventure, as Professor Bajpai was saying a while ago to me, and I really admire that you guys have left your regular work and have come here, and you're teachers and professors yourselves, and now you're back to being students. That's not always easy, I think, right? So thank you. I'm delighted to be here. So I think I'll begin by explaining a little bit about just a couple of slides on my presentation, on my organization and what we do. I would like to encourage discussion as we go along. Please feel free to stop me if you have questions. I'd rather clarify those questions before we move on. I don't know if there's anyone here who's scared of statistics. Good. That used to be me 3 years ago. I started using statistics fairly late in life, because I think I went through my entire schooling convinced that I hate maths and I'm not good at it, and so I will never be able to do quantitative research. And about a year ago, I finished my PhD, which was a quantitative research study. So I just want to tell you, don't carry that baggage with you, that just because you were bad at maths at one time in your life, it does not have to go through for the rest of your life, right? So we are not going to be discussing statistics. That should make some of you happy. We are only going to be talking about methods today. But I do want to say, especially because many of you are probably in the early stages or mid stages of your career, that I chose to learn quantitative methods maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. I'm no expert in doing every kind of quantitative method, but I have to say, the deeper you get involved in it, the more you really understand the value of that method. So don't let your own bias and your own prejudice of, I'm not good at maths, so I'm definitely not going to be good at quantitative work. Don't let that work against you. Take an interest. It takes time to learn, but I think it's really worthwhile. And I think the big advantage is now, unlike when I was in school, right now you have a lot of software that actually does all the computations for you. All you have to do is make sure the data is clean, and that when the results come out, after the analysis is over, that you're able to interpret that data. And as Professor Vajpai mentioned to me, your work doesn't involve highly complicated statistics like economists would do, for instance, and that is their bread and butter of the work that they do. So the kind of statistics you would have to do is really basic, he mentioned. So don't let that turn you off. I think there's always, in life, I think one of the good things is we can always start learning again, right? So I've been able to do it, and I can convince you, I hope to convince you that it's possible to do it and find different results. Okay, so moving forward, 3IE is actually, what's 3IE? That's the name of the organization I work for. It's the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. So the name has 3 I's in it, and that's why we call it 3IE, or that's why the organization is called 3IE. So it's an international NGO, and our work essentially focuses on evaluation and impact evaluation, which is a particular type of evaluation. What do we evaluate? We help governments and other non-profits and researchers worldwide evaluate programs, policies across the world. Our head office is in Delhi, but we have offices in Washington and London. And this was established, the organization was established several years ago and has continued its work since then. So how do we do this? How do we do the kind of work that we do? We have, IE stands for Impact Evaluation. So we have grant windows. Most of these are thematic based. So we give out grants to researchers and non-profits across the world to do evaluations on a particular subject or on a particular theme. So it could be an NGO program, for instance, or we've also given grants in India to people to evaluate NREGA, for instance, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. So we do, we fund evaluations, and then we also, since it's not enough to do evaluation, so let's say I'm doing a study on education sector in India. Let's say there are 50 researchers across the country doing studies on impact evaluation, studies on education, or let's say the schooling system in particular, how does that work? So you have 50 single studies completed over a 10-year period or a 20-year period. But what happens is nobody who's in the field of education has time to read 50 studies because they have their regular work to do in terms of teaching or whatever else that they're doing. So one additional task that we do is we combine the results or the findings of those 50 studies, both in India as well as education research globally, so that someone who's involved, some education person who doesn't have time to read 50 studies or 100 studies over the course of their work, but still wants to know how can we design policy or how can we design programs in a way that are based on evidence or are based on research. We help compile that research for them, right? And those are known as systematic reviews and evidence gap maps. Don't worry if all of this doesn't make sense to you. I think basically all I'm trying to explain is that the organization does evaluations but also synthesizes and consolidates evaluation results to make them more accessible for people like yourselves. I'm not sure if we have any legal studies. I can look into that and share it with Professor Vajpayee. But we work across all sectors, so it is quite likely we might have something on perhaps not in India, but perhaps legal work done in other countries. So I'll take a look at that and share it later. In terms of agenda today, we're going to talk about what is evaluation and why should we evaluate. So this is a brief introduction. Then, like I mentioned, impact evaluation is a very specific form of evaluation. And so what is impact evaluation? And then we're going to talk about quantitative methods and along with some examples. As I mentioned to Professor Vajpayee, we don't have much experience on the legal side of things. But what I've tried to do is look for policy examples and how these methods can be applied to those policy or acts in the Indian context. And hopefully that will help you complete that picture in your mind on how you in your work will be able to use quantitative methods. And I'm sure Professor Vajpayee, when he does additional sessions with you, will probably be talking about that. So my role today is just to introduce these quantitative methods. It's not, if you feel at the end of the session that you're not an expert on any quantitative methods, that wasn't the goal. It's just to introduce you to them so you know they exist, and that if any one particular method appeals to you, you can read up on it on the internet. Much of my learning on stats has been done that way, by the way, so I would strongly recommend it. There's so many resources on the internet. So all you have to do is pick one method, let's say randomized control trials or RCTs as we call them. If you just Google search for that, you'll have a whole list of whole list of search results that you can explore further. There are all sorts of online courses, even for free. So if you want to explore any, and then of course there are actual training programs also conducted by various institutions on quantitative methods. So there's a whole bunch of resources, which is different from when most of us were in school, I think. And so the world has changed, and I think this is one of the big advantages of having the internet, that you can access information and more information on subjects that are useful to you. So the purpose today is simply just to introduce you to these methods, right? Okay, so we'll get started. Any questions before I start? Okay, feel free to stop me as we go along. So what is evaluation? I was wondering if any of you might have any idea about what evaluation is. Any quick thoughts on what it might be? Don't worry about wrong answers. You're not supposed to be experts on evaluation at all. I just wondered whether...
What would assessment?
Yes.
Assessment?
Yes.
If there is a program, how effective is the program? Have they reached the right beneficiary?
That is wonderful. I think between the two of you, you have summarized what is evaluation. So we take a policy, we take an intervention. It could be a national level policy, it could be a state policy, it could even be a rule in this institution. Let's say you want to change a rule on student attendance. You could do an evaluation on how does the current attendance policy work and what should be the changes we should be making. And in very simple terms, that's evaluation, right? And we do this, I think it's important to understand, we do this every day of our lives. When you choose between a blue shirt and a pink shirt, whether I should buy a blue shirt or a pink shirt, it is an evaluation. You're evaluating two products and trying to decide what is most applicable to you. When you choose between should we watch this movie or that movie, you're doing an evaluation. You're saying what are the pros and cons. I don't like Govinda, but I do like Amitabh Bachchan or whatever the situation is. That is an evaluation. So we do this without thinking in our everyday lives. And it's important to understand that this is not an alien concept. We do it without thinking. So our brains are geared to it. When it comes to policies and rules and the law, we just do it a little more systematically so that it's not a question of what I like over what you like, but that it's a more objective study that we are doing. That's the only difference between evaluation in the way that we do it on a regular basis in our minds and evaluation when it's systematically done. So here is a definition of what is evaluation. It refers to the process of determining the worth or the value of a particular program, and we try to make it as systematic and objective as possible. Because if there is bias, if that evaluation is subject to my prejudices or biases, then it's not a real evaluation, it will be a biased evaluation, right? So we try to make it as systematic and objective as possible. Of a planned, ongoing or completed intervention. So you can do evaluations at any of these stages. It doesn't have to be at the end or when it's in the big or when it's ongoing. You can do it at any stage of a policy or intervention. So that's what it says. Evaluations can be prospective. So they're called prospective evaluations if they're done before you implement an intervention. It's called formative if you do it during an intervention. And it's called summative if you do it at the end of an intervention, right? So the only reasons I'm telling you all this is that if at some point you want to look up these terms, then you can look up formative evaluation or prospective evaluation. Otherwise, I think the basic idea we want to communicate is that an evaluation can be done anytime during the life cycle of an intervention or a policy. So why do we do evaluations? We want to check on accountability for results. So we want to know, did the intervention achieve what it was supposed to? If so, who or what was responsible? So this is not to assign blame to anyone. It's to say, if something worked in the state of Haryana, is it possible that that same thing could work in Tamil Nadu, right? So we want to know, before we take this law and implement it in a different state, we want to find out whether it even works in one state before we take it anywhere else. And yes, it's true that Haryana and Tamil Nadu are two very different states, and what works in one state may not work in another state. But the point is, first we need to make sure, does it work in Haryana? Does it even work in Haryana before we try to take it somewhere else, right? So we want to get accountability for results. And then a big part of evaluation is learning what works, what doesn't work, and why. So that we can use those results to improve what we're currently doing, or we can use those results to plan or design something that is an improvement on what we are currently doing, right? Questions so far? Concerns or doubts? No? Okay. So then, let's do an exercise, which I had hoped we could do in groups, but maybe we can just have 4 people talking to each other, like just the row that you're sitting in. Here's the exercise. So let's say you're advisors to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Just pick any ministry you want, it doesn't really matter. You are asked to assess if a particular program caused some percentage decrease in the incidence of under 5 child mortality. So I don't know if you already know this, but India unfortunately has among the highest rates of child mortality for children who are under 5. Many of these unfortunately are due to, why I'm saying unfortunately is because they're due to preventable reasons, like many kids die of diarrhea. So if we had a way to address that, it would be really easy to control these deaths. So it's really unfortunate, but it is one of the things that India needs to do better on. So let's say the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare asks you that here's this particular program that claims to reduce the incidence of child mortality, right? So the ministry has implemented a certain program, and the goal of this program is to reduce child mortality, and it's claiming that it's reducing child mortality. So of course you're advisors, but you don't do all the research yourself in this instance. You hire a group of evaluators to do this work for you, right? So you hire an evaluation team. And after much discussion, the evaluation team says, here's what we're going to do. Here's our plan to measure whether or not this program works. We will measure the incidence of child mortality before the program was implemented. So let's say the program started 2 years ago. So they will look at the incidence of child mortality in 2 years ago. So this is 2017. So 2015, they will look at the incidence. What was the percentage of child mortality at that stage before the program was implemented? Then they will look at the current rate of child mortality. And if child mortality today is lower than what it was 2 years ago, then we can say the program works, right? Okay, so here's the question I'd like you guys to talk about. Would you agree to this evaluation plan? So maybe if you could just do a quick huddle, talk to your neighbor or anybody else just to run ideas past them, just for 2 minutes. Do you think this would be a good idea? If so, why? Do you think this would be a bad idea? If so, why? Is the question clear? I hope the question's clear. If it's not, please just ask.
Because whether it is appropriate for the study to be conducted after the program or during the program will depend on the nature of the program.
Well, just presume the program has been running for 2 years and the ministry is trying to decide should we continue or not. It was a 2-year program, now they want to decide whether to continue or not. So at the moment your goal is only to say, does this work or not? Is this a good way to evaluate or not?
In my opinion, no.
Okay, is there a consensus? How many people say yes? Let's start with those. How many people think this would be a good method to evaluate the program? Would you raise your hands? Nobody. Don't be scared. We're here to learn. As you tell your students, you're here to learn. Okay, a few people. Would you tell me why you think this works? This is a good idea.
If you're measuring the child mortality before, there's a certain level of child mortality at that rate, say X rate, and then you implement the program, because and the focus of implementing the program is to decrease the child mortality. Okay, so and after that if you find this level of child mortality has come down after the program has been implemented, then you say that okay, this program is successful.
Okay, good. And there were some other hands who said yes. Sorry, yeah.
I have the same.
Same thing? Yeah. Anybody else who said yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
The same. If there is a rate come down, it is successful. And
okay. Okay. And you? Same thing? Same thing?
Yeah,
okay.
with certain riders, probably we could also, during the program, an analysis could be made whether the program is moving in the right direction or not.
Okay. But overall, you guys would be happy if the evaluation team suggested this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, right? Okay, good. What about, I think most of the room says no. So I want to hear from those who said no. Why would you say this is a bad idea? Yeah, please go ahead.
I feel that we are doing comparison over here instead of focusing upon how to reduce, how to decrease. We are working upon data collection.
Right.
How it will going to affect.
Okay, so if you don't work on data, how would you know, how would you measure whether or not a program works?
For percentage, we can work on data, but
okay.
To reduce.
So you're talking about what is the kind of intervention that is being implemented. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
By the skeleton or proposal that you have here, it does not sufficiently deal with the possible influence of some other external factors which might have led to a lower mortality rate. For one thing, I would like that when we are studying the mortality rate amongst the beneficiaries of the program, first there has to be demarcation in terms of some identifiable marker. That other things being same, whether this program made a difference or not. This particular proposal does not give that detail.
Okay.
That is, the people perhaps from the same economic strata, perhaps from the same geographic region, perhaps accessing the same quality of medical facilities or hygienic environment, and then other things being equal, will this program make a difference or not? That will then be attributable to the program. Otherwise, just a lower rate of mortality can be a result of many things.
Okay, well said. Anybody else with who said no but has something to add?
It's sort of along the same lines, but the point here is that I would not take a decision on how successful the program is on the basis of one yardstick of measurement. I
one
want to
indicator.
include more, so I get a more holistic picture.
Okay. Anybody else?
Ma'am, apart from the government, it has also to be seen that whether there are other players who are contributing to reduce the child mortality rate.
Yes. Okay, well said again. Good point. Anybody else? Okay, I hereby declare you all evaluators because those are the very same. That's pretty good, I think, for people who don't deal with this in the everyday of life. This is the kind of these are the kind of challenges we run into in our research when we try to do evaluations. So for those of you who have not understood what is going on, I'm going to explain this, but I'm going to explain it with an example. So this is, I think, my only international example, mostly because it demonstrates the case pretty well. But this was an actual study, so I wanted to use this as an example. So this is the story of Russia, sometime in the 1990s, and there was a health reform pilot project implemented by the Russian government, which sort of decentralized healthcare, because health indicators in Russia were not good at that stage. Health outcomes deteriorated. And so one of the ways the government wanted to try and deal with it is they said, okay, instead of centralizing the expenditure on health outcomes, let's decentralize to the level of the regions in Russia. As you know, it's a very large country, so they thought having central control over that is probably leading to non-expenditure or delayed expenditure or whatever, and they decided this was an experiment, it was a pilot project. So the government said, we'll do it in 2 regions and we'll check what's happening before we decide whether to do this on a national scale, given that it's a very large country, all right? So the project objectives, I've listed them there, but you don't really have to worry about them. But they're trying to improve cardiovascular health and reproductive health among the people. So they got a loan, I think it was from the World Bank, in order to test this pilot. And the evaluation was looking at whether improvements in service delivery of health services and whether the pilot could inform larger national level reforms, right? So this was the study that was officially funded. Now, here is a graph, and for people who hate stats, I'll explain the graph. So along the x-axis or the horizontal axis, you have the years listed out, and on the y-axis, you have the abortion rates. So abortion rates was one of the indicators. So as I mentioned, one of the objectives of the reform was targeting reproductive health. And so one of the indicators they used was the number of abortions conducted. So you see, the program started, so this is the data from 2 regions. I think one is Kaluga and one is Tver, that's the name of the 2 Russian regions. And in 1997, the health reform pilot project was started. So is it visible from the back? Can you see? So these are the 2 colors for the 2 regions. And you see the pilot started here. It's the health reform pilot project. And what do you notice about the trend? Is the trend for abortions going up or going down? It's declining, right? So this should tell us that this is a great project and that it's actually having a good impact on, the pilot had a good impact on at least this indicator. So we're not talking about the full health reforms, we're just looking at one indicator of the health reform, and at least on the number of abortions, abortions due to illness of the mother or whatever else, the kind of abortions we would want to prevent. This project seems to be doing well on that, right? Okay. Overall, would you be in agreement that the rates are declining? Yeah?
Initially, the rates have increased in Kaluga.
Right.
From 97 to 98, 99, they haven't. Later on, they have to.
Yeah. So over a period of time, abortion rates are not going to suddenly fall also. That's how it is with health indicators, that change is slow. So that's very normal. But overall, we'd see this as a positive sign. Unfortunately, here's what the trend before shows. Okay, so what has happened is, here, this is where the project started. And yes, of course, the rate was declining. But even before the project, there was a decline, right? So the project may or may not have had a difference because the rates were already declining and the steepest fall was actually before the project. So with all of these rates, one thing to remember is beyond a point they plateau. So, in some cases they'll fall very steeply, and then after that the fall is, if there is a fall, it's going to be very minimal. It's not going to be, as steep as ever, because you can never reach a rate of 0. You're never going to have a population with a 0 abortion rate, except maybe in Scandinavian countries or something. So, if we only considered evaluation of the health project in the time that we considered it, yes, the results look like, oh, the rates of abortions are declining. But then when you look at the overall trends, we find that in those same 2 regions, the rate was already declining, right? So we have to take a more, I think, as you guys pointed out, when we were talking about the example I gave earlier, and the exercise question, we have to look at what are the trends even prior to what we were trying to implement, right? And then those were 2 regions. These are more of the Russian regions, and you see there's a decline all across the board, right? So what can we learn from this? So a key decline, a decline in the key outcome indicator is not sufficient to conclude that the project worked, right? So although the rates are declining, in my example I had asked you that can we look at child mortality in 1 year, like 2 years ago, and child mortality at the end of 2 years, and can we say the project has worked? No, we can't, because we have to consider what has been the trend even prior to that. And then in this case, there wasn't much evidence connecting the outcome, which is the abortion rate, to the project itself, because it was already declining. So how can we claim that our project worked well and that's why the rate is declining? Because the rate was declining even before we implemented our project, right? So examining trends before the project, in the project area, and similar non-project areas during the project can be helpful because you have a comparison then. So we saw that in the 2 regions that the project covered, there was a decline. But when the last slide I showed, where it was all regions, there was also a decline where the project was not being implemented. And there was still a decline, right? So this is an overall trend that was applicable to the regions and to the Russian regions. Therefore, we cannot claim that the pilot project that was implemented actually had wonderful results, right?
No.
And yeah.
But then we can look into the reasons why it declined during the project period.
Or you could look at whether it was steeper declines, or you could look at, are you comparing appropriate groups? So all of that, yes, but just on the basis of here's this graph with these 2 details, we cannot say that it was our pilot that contributed to it because there was already a declining trend, right? If the reverse had happened, if you had seen an increasing trend, then our project is implemented and suddenly we see a decline. Then it gives us more ground to question, okay, so now the reasons it could be our project, but it could also be that women just in that particular month or year decided, okay, we're not going to get on. So there are any number of external influences that we cannot control. And so when we claim that this is the effect of this project or this policy or this intervention, we need to make sure that is the net effect of that intervention and it's not influenced by outside causes, right? So that, if you can get or understand that, that's the sum total of evaluation, right? Are we comparing the right things? Are we measuring the right things? And are we ruling out all external influences when we say that something caused something to happen, right? Okay, so what that tells us is we need a counterfactual. This is just a complicated term, which means we need a comparison group. So we have to compare areas that implemented the project with areas that did not implement the project to see what is the change, or to be able to measure what is the change. So a counterfactual is simply the outcome for a program beneficiary if he or she had not participated in the program. So the women in the Russian pilot who were having abortions, we have to compare what happened in the areas where the pilot was implemented, what happened in the areas where it was not implemented, and then try and find out if the women had not participated in the pilot, would the rate have been higher or lower, right? But this is where we run into difficulty. So we can observe only one outcome at a time. So if, let's say, we want to measure the impact of attending this training workshop today, right? In order to be able to say whether this workshop had any influence on increasing your confidence in quantitative methods, I would first have to measure what is your understanding of quantitative methods before the workshop, and then I would have to understand what is your understanding of quantitative methods after the workshop. The difficulty is you are already participants here. In order to see what the counterfactual would be, I need to be able to measure what happens if you don't participate in this workshop, right? So there are two ways of, there are two things I need to look at. One is your understanding of quantitative methods when you participate in the program, but one is your understanding of quantitative methods when you don't participate in the program. But the problem is this group is, I can only see you in one condition, and that is the condition that you're here, right? I cannot observe you when you didn't participate in the program. So how do I measure that? The difficulty, one way to do it is to give you a test before you come in, and then give you a test after you, when we are done, and say, okay, if average score at the beginning on understanding of quantitative methods was, let's say, 60%, and after the workshop it's now become 70%, then we can claim that this worked, that now the workshop was useful in increasing your awareness of quantitative methods. But again, there's a difficulty here. You're only looking at pre and post data, which was the starting point of our problem, where we said, what are the external influences? Maybe there were some of you who already had a very high awareness level of quantitative methods, so my workshop didn't do anything to change that. You already knew that, right? Or maybe the exam was much simpler than most of you anticipated, and you could have done well because of that. So the big challenge in evaluation, all I'm trying to say is, the big challenge in evaluation is finding a comparison group. Because this is the group of people who participated. Who should I compare you with in order to be able to measure the difference between you and somebody else, in order to say this is directly attributable to the training workshop or the intervention or the policy, right? So the only difference between a valid group, comparison group, and the treatment group, which is the group that participated, the only difference between them should be that the treatment group has received an intervention or has participated in some program. That should be the only difference. But to do that is extremely difficult. How do you find a group that's exactly comparable to you? They're only different. The only difference between the two groups is that you participated in the program and the comparison group didn't. And this is constantly the challenge of evaluators, right? So, just summing up, what is the challenge of the comparison group? We only observe one outcome at a time. So I can either see you participating or I can see you not participating. I can't see you in both conditions. The same person is either participating, this one person is either participating or not participating. I don't get to see them in both conditions simultaneously, right? So either they participate or they don't participate. We cannot observe outcomes of a program participant in the absence of the program because the person has already participated. So we need to construct a control group. Since I can't use the same person, I have to construct a comparison group. And that is what quantitative methods help you to do, right? And that's, next we're going to move on and talk about the methods. How can we construct this comparison group? Because if you want your comparison to be valid, it has to be a group that is extremely similar to the group that participated or benefited or was affected by the policy that you're trying to evaluate, right? And that is the sum total of quantitative methods, and that is what we call impact evaluation, right? Okay, so before we move on to methods, do you guys have questions? Yeah?
Ma'am, was sampling feature anywhere before this?
Sampling is a whole, I'm not going to be talking about sampling today, mostly because it is an extremely complicated field. It's a very important part of what you're doing, but it would take a lot longer than I had to even, just to get through the methods alone is going to be a race. But I would strongly encourage you to, I think it's an excellent point. Sampling is by itself really important. So what I will talk about random sampling just a little bit in passing. But there are many different ways to sample, and even random sampling has many different ways. Like You can do stratified random samples, etc. So sampling is a whole subject for a workshop by itself. I haven't attended one, but I've known of 5-day workshops on sampling alone, right? So it's a very good subject, and if you explore methods further, if you choose to explore methods further in your work, I would strongly recommend doing some kind of training on sampling. But excellent question. Right? Any other questions or doubts before we move? Yeah.
Ma'am, a small concern, like, are the two groups just similar to each other? And the only difference being that one has received the training and the other has not.
Yes.
So, what are the other similarities? Like, the only difference being this.
The only difference ideally should be that, right? So, for instance, I don't know if this will make it more real, but say there was a training program, you attended the training program, I didn't, right? So, now we want to figure out, there's just the two of us, and we want to do an evaluation on, does this work? Because our pilot was sending you for the program. Now we want to see if the room full of people should be sent for that program. But we want to know, was the program useful? So one way of doing that is just to ask you, do you think the program works? Maybe you were in a good mood that day and you said, yeah, the professor was great and we really enjoyed it. That's your subjective opinion. Maybe if someone's in a bad mood that day, they say, no, that professor sucked and it was horrible and we should never do this again. But we don't want a subjective opinion. That's your opinion, it's not an evaluation, right? You are evaluating on a personal basis, but it's not a systematic, objective evaluation on the basis of which we should decide the future of these 40 people, right? So how would we compare them? So one way is, I didn't attend that workshop, and so we do a test. This I'm just making up. We give you a quiz, I take the quiz, same quiz, and the quiz focuses on, let's say, legal research methods. But because you participated in the workshop, you do better on that than I do. We look at the difference in scores. Maybe if you do better, we say, oh, this must be a good thing. But then here's the problem. Am I an appropriate comparison for you? Now that is the big question. We don't know that, right? Because, okay, so what are the similarities between us? We're both women, we're both Indian women, but there are a million ways in which we are different as well. We don't know what my career choices have been and how they've influenced my background on legal research methods, right? So maybe because you've been teaching in this field or you've already been in this field, you already know more than I do. So my score is going to be low anyway because I don't know much about legal research, and your score is going to be high even before you attended the workshop, right? Plus there are many, these are the observable characteristics between the two of us. So on observable characteristics, there is still a way of comparing. But there are many unobservable characteristics that make us different that we don't know about. Like, have I had any exposure to legal research methods? No. Have you had any exposure to legal research? Yes. So you're going to do better than me anyway, so I'm not an appropriate comparison group for you. What would be an appropriate comparison group is someone who's had the same exposure to legal research methods that you have had, right? And then we can compare. That would be a more appropriate comparison group. So that's why it all comes down to, you should be comparable on, let's say, your nationality, your sex, and this doesn't always have to be the case. I'm just giving this as an example in this case. What are the comparable characteristics will vary from study to study because it depends on the outcome you're looking at, right? But in this case, whether my profession and your profession are the same are a key factor because I don't work in the field of law and therefore I'm not a suitable comparison for you. But somebody else, one of your colleagues here who does work in the field of law, may be a more appropriate comparison group for you. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's an extreme simplification of the issue, but I'm just trying to explain it so that you understand why we need a counterfactual. That counterfactual has to be as alike as possible. In the ideal world, we would have twins, and identical twins who would go into, one would be given the treatment, because identical twins biologically are supposed to be most similar to each other. They are the most similar human beings to each other in the world. So ideally, for every situation, we would have identical twins, one who would get the treatment, whatever it was, and the other who would not, and then we can compare results, because they're so similar biologically, genetically, that you could say it's almost like having the same person experience something and not experience something, and then you can compare the difference. But in real life, that doesn't happen, right? Even siblings, blood-related siblings, are very different from each other. So constructing that comparison group is the biggest challenge. Constructing the counterfactual is the biggest challenge of impact evaluation, right? And that's why these methods have developed to try and see, can I say any of the methods are foolproof? I'll start by saying no. There is no foolproof method. So every time you read a study, you can probably find flaws in terms of, how did they set up that comparison group? Because I don't think this is appropriate. It is the job of the researcher or the evaluator to convince you that the comparison group and the treatment group are similar, because if they are not, the results of that study are flawed, right? So as researchers ourselves, it's our job to construct. You can never have a perfect comparison group. So what we do is try to do the next best. Like, how can we make it as similar as possible, such that the only difference between them is that one group participated and the other group did not participate in the intervention on the policy. Okay, I saw some hands. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
One kind of impact evaluation could be, let's say we are talking about a policy or an intervention, as you mentioned. It has a very clear intended objective. So in such situations, identifying the objective against which the impact evaluation will be done is not a very arduous task. It's obvious.
Yeah.
And so the methodologies obviously will depend on that. When we are trying to do an impact evaluation of an unintended consequence of a policy,
right?
So will that result in a change of methods, or will the methods that you'll be discussing are the same for both?
Very good question. The methods will always depend on your research question. So for instance, I think the easiest way I can give you is an example, because when policymakers implement a policy or when legislators implement a law, they have a certain objective in mind. The unintended consequences of that law may not be clear, right? Sometimes things just happen, right? So the law may be to protect something, but then on the sideline something else is happening, which you may know because that same law may have been implemented in a different state or in a different country. So maybe there was some side effect there that we know about from the literature or the media or whatever. But many times it happens, there's no precedent, and so as a result of that, you don't actually know what is the outcome, what is this unintended consequence. So for instance, I did my dissertation on NREGA, which is I think an act that you're all familiar with, the government's right to work given to disadvantaged groups. Now, what the act is trying to do is to raise income, to provide employment and therefore raise income levels among poor rural households. And it's open to all rural households, not just poor rural households, because the government's expecting, they didn't want to invest time and money in trying to figure out who's poor and who's not poor, because as you know, or as you may know, that's a controversy, or that's controversial in this country to figure out who's poor and who's not poor. The economists have come up with multiple ways to measure poverty, but we still can't define what poverty is in this country. When you walk out and meet a poor person, you know they're poor. But the economists struggle to try to define what is the poverty line in India and how does it correspond with the international poverty line, for instance. So, leaving all of that aside, NREGA was implemented to raise income among rural households. So the government's initiative is great because it provides the right to work to a bunch of households that either are unemployed or are underemployed. And they gave a special impetus to women by reserving 33% of the jobs for women, saying, okay, we want women to come out and work, which is also great. Like, I think there's no way you can't support that. But what are the unintended outcomes? And that's what I examined in my PhD dissertation, because my passion is children. I'm very fond of working with children and seeing what the impacts of policies are on them. So I examined the impact of NREGA on children, which was nowhere in the scope of implementing the policies. NREGA is actually, surprisingly enough, when I was reading the act, is very child-friendly. Why? Because one, it provides for daycare on the site itself. So if there are more than 6 children of a certain, like below 5 or whatever, the act itself provides for some, like one of the mothers who's come to work will be employed on this, will be employed to look after those children, right? It prohibits the employment of anyone below the age of 18. We know a number of kids in the country work as child laborers. NREGA forbids the employment of any child below the age of 18, which is the legal age of how we recognize what is children. So from that perspective, NREGA is actually pretty child-friendly, if you look at it, even though the policy was not designed to be focused on children, right? But guess what happens in real life? In real life, kids are employed on NREGA work sites. In real life, daycare is not provided. And so I tried to do an evaluation for my dissertation on what are the impacts of NREGA. So what I found using some of the quasi-experimental methods that I will talk about, what I found was that among households that participated in NREGA, child labor was actually higher than among households that did not participate in NREGA. Now that's an unintended consequence. Did the government of India start out a policy saying we're going to provide employment to poor households and then we also hope to increase child labor? I don't think any government starts out by saying that. But this is an unintended consequence because what is happening is mothers are moving out of the household to work on NREGA job sites. So who takes over the work that the mother was originally doing? Any guesses? The children, especially the daughters. Yeah, they are pulled out of school when the parents go out to work for NREGA. Girl children especially are pulled out of school to handle their younger siblings and the household chores, or if the family has a small farm or something, the girl tends to that. Boys are pulled out to take over from like paid employment that maybe what the fathers were doing originally, or if the mother was running a tea stall or something, the boys are pulled out to handle that. So NREGA has the unintended consequence of, and this may not, I hesitate to say this is applicable. I did use a data set that was national, but I also want to hesitate to say that this is foolproof. It's not, because it's quasi-experimental, so it could be applicable in some cases, but not applicable in other cases, right? Plus the profile of households that participate in NREGA and don't participate in NREGA are very different, because it's the poorest who are participating in NREGA. Whereas those who choose not to participate in NREGA may be doing so because they don't need NREGA money and they don't want to do hard physical labor. But it could also be that they're so poor and so disadvantaged that they don't know how to negotiate the NREGA registration system and to get employment, right? So these are some of the flaws of my own study, and therefore I would hesitate to put it out there that NREGA causes child labor. But my question was, how does NREGA, my research question was, how does NREGA affect children? And therefore my methods depended on my question. And this is an unintended consequence of NREGA. So you first, when you're doing your research, you would first define your question and then choose your methods depending on what your question is. In some cases, quantitative methods are appropriate. In other cases, you would be fine using qualitative methods only, right? As an institution, we strongly recommend mixed methods, which is a combination of both, because the quantitative stuff allows you to analyze large numbers, but the qualitative stuff allows you to talk to people and figure out, to smaller groups of people, and figure out why is this happening. Like, if I could have done mixed methods in my dissertation research, I would have liked to talk to households participating and say, what is it that motivates you to put your children to work? As opposed to the government's understanding that if household gets employment, then income will increase, and then if income increases, expenditure on food and education would actually improve. So the government's original idea may be that, oh, because income increases, children will now be in school. Whereas we are finding out actually something else is happening in some of those households, right? So I hope I answered your question on, yeah. Other questions before we move on? Okay, so let's talk about methods. So methods usually, rigorous impact evaluations usually use experimental or what is known as quasi-experimental methods to construct a counterfactual. Remember, that is our goal. We're trying to construct a comparison group. The experimental methods are called randomized control trials, or RCTs, and then quasi-experimental methods, there's a whole bunch of them, and we'll be talking about those. Again, I'll remind you, you're not going to be experts at the end of this lecture. The only thing I'm trying to accomplish here is introducing you to different methods. So don't worry if you don't get every detail of every method. This is the very first time you may be hearing some of these, so don't worry if you don't understand. As long as you know the name of the method, you can Google it or look for additional training resources, right? So let's start with randomized control trials. Now this method, you might be interested to know, is actually borrowed from the health sciences, from medical control trials, like drug trials. So when a new drug is discovered and they want to check how does this drug affect different groups of patients, they usually take a group of patients, give half of them the drug and leave half of them without the drug, and then try and measure what are the health outcomes of those patients to determine whether a drug works or not. Clearly, one trial is not enough for that. They do multiple trials to make sure that the results are consistent. But this is a method that is borrowed from clinical trials, which is why it's called a randomized control trial or a randomized clinical trial in some cases. So RCTs is how it's commonly known. If you look for that, you'll probably find even on YouTube like a million examples to explain what RCTs are, right? So what does a randomized control trial do? It randomly assigns people to a treatment condition and a control condition and then compares outcomes across these groups, right? What does that mean? So here's this list of eligible people. So here's this group of people who are eligible to participate in a workshop. This could be 50, it could be 100, it could be thousands, it could be any number of people. So if it's a policy like NREGA, for instance, it could be 1.2 billion people who have access, who could have potential access to this policy, right? So this is what we call step 1, your eligible units. So you take the list of eligible units. From there you take a sample, because we can't, in our study, we can't study 1.2 billion people. So what we will do, and she raised the question about sampling earlier, how do you choose a good sample is another, like I said, it's a big topic of discussion. Ideally in your sample, you would have representatives from that are representative, you would have people who are representing all aspects of your eligible units. So you should have women, you should have children, you should have men, any combination of the above. So that would be your evaluation sample. So choosing your evaluation sample would be step 2. And the final step would be random assignment. What happens there? So by the roll of dice or by a lottery, we would decide which half of the evaluation sample gets assigned to a particular treatment. So this is a group that did not get assigned to treatment, and then you have the other half who gets assigned to treatment, right? So say we have 100 people who've applied to this workshop. That is our evaluation sample, because it's a small group, we can cover all of them, right? 100 people applied, but we only have room for 40 people. How do we decide? Suppose we were conducting a randomized control trial to measure the effectiveness of this workshop. How would we do it? So 100 people have applied, and now we need to figure out how do we measure the effectiveness, or how do we allow 100 people have applied, how do we figure out which 40 get to participate in the workshop? So what we would do, one potential option is we could take a list of their names, put it into a bowl, and then mix up those results nicely and pick out 40 names. And the 40 names that we pick out participate in the program. The 60 that we don't is our comparison group, right? So that would be the simplest method to do it. Similarly, if the government wanted to implement NREGA across all 600 something districts of India, but they didn't know which districts to choose because all districts want to participate in the program, then what they would do is put the names of all 600 districts into a bowl and pick out randomly which districts get to participate, because we only have limited funding and we can't do it across all 600 people, all 600 districts, right? So these are all hypothetical examples. There are also ways to do random there are websites that can pull out random numbers for you. There is an Excel function in Excel, Microsoft Excel, which can do this for you. So there are multiple ways to do it when the numbers are large. If it's 10 people, you can just pick it out yourself. But when the list runs into thousands, it gets really hard. And so we have automated systems to do it. I understand you have SPSS training tomorrow, and so there's a function that allows you to do that in SPSS as well, right? So basically what you're doing is, from a group of participants, you are randomly choosing. I'm not saying you get to participate and the rest of you don't. I'm randomly choosing. And that is the trick. Because if I choose you, I am biasing my sample, because maybe people sitting in front have some characteristics that are different from the backbenchers, which is my favorite place as well when I'm in a classroom, right? So you cannot say this group is exactly comparable to the group sitting at the back, right? It just so happens we have a lot of gentlemen sitting at the back and a lot of ladies sitting in front. It would automatically bias the sample already, right? So what you do is a random sample, where I as the researcher have no control on who gets selected to be in treatment and who gets selected to be in comparison. So these groups will still be different. It won't be that you will have exactly the same number of women and exactly the same number of men. That's not going to happen. It could be that you have 2 extra men or 5 extra men or 3 extra women or whatever. So the groups are not going to be balanced from that perspective. But what we're looking for statistically is that the groups are balanced on average. When you look at average outcomes in both groups, because there was no human error or human bias determining who went to treatment and who went to control, on average, this has been statistically proven that the groups are comparable. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we're not, I think this is one of the confusing aspects. Statistically, they are equivalent. They may not be equivalent when you look at them and you say, "Arey, but there are 5 men there and there are only 2 women in that group," whereas the treatment group is very different. Yes, that's correct. It's the fact that statistically they have proven over and over that on average, the groups are comparable. So if you do a 1:1 comparison, they're not comparable. But statistically on average, because they've been distributed outside the control of the researcher, it's by a computer program or lottery system or whatever, they are statistically equivalent, right? Okay, so that's how we would assign, randomly assign people to treatment and control. This is the simplest way to measure impact. And the RCTs are known as the gold standard. The reason for that is because there is no other method that can come close to this level of random assignment. And these are the randomized control trials are the basis on which drugs are prescribed or the efficacy of drugs are proven. And that's why they are known as the gold standard, because among all the methods that are available to us, this is the method that produces the most objective results. So in most cases, organizations, individuals, and now even governments are getting into this mode of trying to do randomized control trials because they provide the best evidence that is possible. The difficulty and challenge is, can anyone think of difficulties and challenges of implementing RCTs? What could be some potential? Like, why do we have other methods? If this is the gold standard, we should be using this one.
Geographical difference could be there.
But on average, they are statistically equivalent. So that's not a reason not to do RCTs, right? So good point, but we're not humanly assigning. So what could be some reason? I mean, why isn't everybody just using RCTs?
Let's say if I want to compare both the genders, if I'm doing a study on trafficking, so I'm studying both girl children and boy children, what is the impact of trafficking on both? So then in that case, I'll try to have equal sample of both. So in that case, certified random sampling wants to.
Yeah. So there are some situations, I think the point that she's trying to make is there are some situations where you cannot randomly assign. So for instance, there's traffic, it's in one case it could be unethical. So let's say we want to study the effects of trafficking. Can you imagine a situation in which we say, okay, we randomly assign, here's a group of women, we randomly assign half of them to be trafficked and the other half not to be trafficked. Do you think that's possible? Who's going to allow you to traffic women? It's illegal, right? Who knows better than a group of people?
Where we are seeing because I was studying the children who were being trafficked.
Right.
So they had already been trafficked. So
Right.
afterwards I'm just looking at it.
Yeah.
That's why
Yeah, then that would be your sample. But there are many other situations. So there you're taking a group of trafficked children and then you could perhaps, if you're trying to do some kind of therapy, for instance. So you take a sample of trafficked children and randomly assign half of them to therapy and the other half don't get therapy for the time being anyway, right? Although there are ethical concerns around, here's a group of children that need therapy, but you're not giving them therapy because you want your research to be objective. So typically how we address that is we don't give it to them for a certain period, for the duration of our study. The moment our study completes, you allow them the treatment as well, right? Because we don't want to deprive kids of, or whoever, of anything that they might need. So yeah, that would be a different situation altogether, but there are many situations in which you cannot randomly assign treatment because it's unethical or because there's some other issues. There are issues in which the government, for instance, right now has already implemented NREGA. So we cannot assign people to participate in NREGA and not participate in NREGA because it's already being implemented across the country. So retrospectively, RCTs cannot be done because the program is already under, it's already underway. You can randomly compare two groups of NREGA beneficiaries, but you cannot compare beneficiaries with, you cannot randomly assign some to participate in NREGA and some households not to participate in NREGA because the program is already being implemented, right? Okay, so in terms of random assignment, you would assign by beneficial. You can do random assignment at the block, at the individual level, at the cluster level. You could do it at block level, and you could use an encouragement design where it's available to everyone. So for NREGA, where we say it's technically available to any rural household that wants to apply. So how would we do an RCT there? What we could do is send a particular group of randomly assigned households. We could encourage them to participate by sending them a postcard or by telling them, visiting their households and saying, hey, we'll help you fill out the application work, but we want you to participate, right? So if we do that with a group of 100 households, some of them will apply, some of them will not apply, and then we can use that to construct a counterfactual, right? So there are many different ways to work. I've seen researchers use many creative designs which involve RCTs, but the problem with RCTs is they're not always possible, so we need a backup method, right? So RCTs are not always possible because they may be unethical. They're also known to be really expensive. So that's another reason why. You cannot use existing data to conduct an RCT. You actually have to physically assign one group to receive a treatment and one group not to receive a treatment. So they're particularly apt or applicable for situations in which the program has not yet started. There you can randomly assign half, because many times it happens the government doesn't have money to fund all 5,000 people who apply, or NGOs don't have money to fund all 5,000 people who apply. So a lottery is one of the most fairest ways of assigning. Instead of saying, acha, the first 50 get through, the first 50 may not be the ones who deserve, who are the most needy ones, right? So lottery system can actually, at least in the US and all these places, it's become very common that government benefits, when it cannot be given to everyone who applies, they're given out by lottery, so that it's a fair system because no human, it's a computerized lottery system. And so people make the argument, researchers make the argument that if there is no money to cover everyone, then the lottery system may be one of the best ways to assign people to a condition or not. And then in that case, you have the additional benefit of having a treatment group and a control group that you can compare, and allows you to evaluate, is this intervention effective or is this policy effective, right? There's a quick experiment. If you just give me a couple minutes more and then we'll break. Is that okay? I just wanted to give an example. So this was an example of an RCT which was conducted in Gujarat. So as you know, Gujarat has a lot of our manufacturing industries, and therefore pollution levels are really high. And so to monitor pollution levels, pollution regulatory authorities usually use third-party auditors. So they pick up a third-party auditor who would then go to a particular factory and check pollution emission levels and all of that, right? But there is a conflict of interest here, because guess who pays the third-party auditors? It's the factory owner. So I think it's very evident there's a conflict of interest where the factory owner, as you know, this is our country and all sorts of things happen under the table and behind the doors. And so, are these results fair? Do the auditors present genuine, authentic results remains in question, right? So this particular study took 2 heavily polluted regions in Gujarat. All the firms in those 2 regions were randomly assigned to 2 different situations. So there was a control condition where everything just continued as normal. In the experimental condition, in the treatment group, auditors were assigned to a firm rather than the firm being free to pick their own auditors, right? So the industry was not allowed, or the factory owner was not allowed to pick his own auditor with whom he had many years of a relationship, instead of which auditors were randomly assigned to factory owners. The funds for paying that auditor did not come from the factory owner. There was some part of the grant money was used to pay the auditor. So the auditor was no longer paid by the factory owner. This was another treatment. And then finally, 20% of the audits were back-checked to see that does the actual pollution level and the audit report submitted, does that match, right? So this was the treatment condition. All the other factories served as the control group. So here's the result of this particular study. So there was more accurate reporting. So first of all, you see that the pollution levels between the first one, this panel A here, what you will see is that the modified system led to more accurate reporting. So you see the modified column there, and you will notice that the bars are higher. Both the factories that were back checked as well as the ones with just audit. So all you're comparing is these levels with these levels. So the reporting is better when in the treatment condition. So when factory owners do not pay auditors and do not choose auditors, reporting is automatically higher. Yeah. And then overall, on the right, on the other panel, you'll notice that overall, suspended particulates ppm of all firms went down under the treatment condition, right? So this was an example of a randomized control trial, which was used to see what is the effect of this particular reform, which was being pilot tested on behalf of the government of Gujarat, to see does it work better than the existing system, right? Okay. Yeah, sorry.
How do we use the comparison group for the existing position?
Yeah, so all the factories in 2 regions were divided into, randomly assigned, again, randomly divided into 2 groups. One group received the back checking and the auditor being paid by a central pool, and auditor not being assigned randomly. The control group was the group that was not affected by any of these reforms. Right? So all the factories participated in the trial.
Those who remained out of the randomly selected ones.
Correct. Well, random selection means one group gets treatment, one group does not. So one group of factories was not touched at all. The current prevailing system just continued as normal there. Their results were then checked with the treatment group to see who's reporting higher levels of pollution. And it turned out that the ones, no surprise, the auditors who were not paid by the factory owners were obviously doing a better job than the ones who were paid by the factory owners, right? In fact, it's a pretty detailed study, but there's certain legal limit of pollution that is, I haven't brought that graph here because I didn't want to get too technical. There's a certain level of legal pollution limit that is allowed, that is permissible, and in the control condition, most auditors were reporting that the factory was, or that a majority of the factories were exactly at that level. They weren't below and they weren't higher, they were exactly at the permissible level, showing that the auditor was basically not reporting accurately. They're saying, if this is the level, it's just below that level. If this is the permissible level of pollution, it is just below the permissible level, right?
These were the 100 factories.
I forget the exact number. I think it was like 2,000 factories or something.
2,000 factories. Out of that, we randomly selected how many?
1,000 one way and 1,000 the other way.
2,000. Out of them, we took a total of 2,000, and out of 2,000, then we took a random sample of 1,000.
Right. No. 2,000, let's look at it as 2,000 names were put into a bowl, and 1,000 were removed randomly to be assigned to the treatment condition. The remaining 1,000 served as the control group. Right? But it doesn't always, I should point out, it doesn't always have to be equal. Right? You could have 60 functioning as control and 40 functioning as treatment, right? What's more important, it's not the numbers. You need a certain number, your sample has to be a certain number to assure you of results, but it doesn't have to be equal.
Representative.
It has to be representative, it has to be randomly selected so that my bias doesn't influence which factory gets selected, right? Yeah.
From what I understand, what we're talking about is pretty theoretical. What I would like to understand is how do you get these factories to actually agree that they are ready to undergo this control and just a regular treatment? Because unless until you sort of involve some authority out there to get them to agree, at least I don't understand that, why they would agree to such a thing. So
well, the control group is not affected at all. So you don't have to tell them anything because you want the control condition to continue as normal.
Exactly. So but this particular treatment is rendered.
To the ones, but in this particular case, as I mentioned, this was done on behalf of the Gujarat government. So it was done on behalf of the regulatory authority. They were involved in helping us design, not us, the group that did the study. They were helping them. They were the ones saying, we have this new idea on how to control pollution levels, but we don't know if it's going to work. So can you help us design an experiment that will test whether or not this works? So it was tested in only 2 regions there because they wanted to see how does this work here before we try to scale up to other countries. So in fact, one conference I attended, the Gujarat Pollution Regulatory Board, the representative showed up to present the results of the thing and they were super excited about it because they had some actual evidence to show this system works better. And of course, governments don't always do RCTs because they think they're too complicated, etc., etc. So they're extremely proud of this study because they told the factories that this is a new system we are trying. And so when it's your regulatory board telling you, we want you to participate, you do participate. But not all this is just an example, not all RCTs involve the government. You can do them at a local community level as well. Right? Yeah.
Just as a concern, like, what can be the other cases where we can apply these RCTs? Like, can it be even the impact of the Hindu succession amendment on women?
You may not be able to study that at the national level. And I think one reason, one thing I should probably point out here is how applicable is an RCT for you in your work depends on your research question. It is the gold standard, but the point is you can't use the gold standard everywhere. And you may find in your case where all the laws are already implemented, how do you do an RCT? All you can perhaps do is take smaller groups, not the whole country or whatever, but say you want to study the impact of a particular succession law, let's say, on a group of women in the city of, I don't know, Delhi, let's say. So even then you can't take the whole city of Delhi. So you're looking at a particular area and you're saying this is only my effort to understand what is happening. You may be perfectly justified in only doing qualitative research with that group because all you do is put them in a focus group discussion and say, what do you think about this law and how has it affected you? Another way to do it is maybe you want to raise awareness on the level of, here's a law, how it affects women or how it affects anybody else. In that case, that's a new intervention. Although it pertains to the law, it's a new intervention that you're doing. In that case, it's possible to do an RCT. See who's interested, assign half to the awareness workshop. Don't assign the other half function as the control group or whatever, and you can compare results. So the reason for sharing this method with you is to tell you here's the gold standard. This is not to tell you you should follow this everywhere. In my entire life, I have not been able to do an RCT because just the projects I work with or the research questions I'm trying to measure RCTs are not the best way to get there. And you may find that in your work. But it's important you're aware of what the gold standard is and how the other methods fall short of the gold standard. So I started with the gold standard to tell you here's the best method we know about so far. Maybe in the future something new will come up. And then after the break we're going to be talking about other methods and how they fall short of the gold standard. Because in this case, human error is not involved in deciding who the control group is because it's randomly assigned. Every other method we don't have a random assignment. And so it's a little flawed, right? So I wanted you to understand the gold standard before moving on to other methods. It may or may not be applicable in your work. It depends on the research question that you're trying to ask, right? So don't start out with every research question saying, now I'm to do an RCT. No, that's wrong. In all the years I've done research, I have not been able to do an RCT. It's one of my frustrations because I'd like to see it up close. But it's just that the kind of questions I have been focused on do not involve
The sampling method.
Sorry?
The method of sampling.
Randomized control trials. RCTs is randomized control trials. So you may not be able to use this method all the time in your work. Right? So after break, we'll talk about other methods you may be better able to use.